The agency wagon came in dragging dust behind it, while Marrick stood in the loading pen with a split rail under one boot and 38 hungry men, watching the road like salvation ought to arrive wearing an apron. A red steer slammed the gate behind him. Clay caught the rail before it jumped loose, felt the jolt run up his arms, and glanced once toward the empty cookhouse. Cold ash still lay in the stove. Flour still streaked the plank floor where the last cook had quit before daylight and left spite in every pan. By noon, the rail buyer from Cheyenne would be counting 200 head of beef. By sundown, if those cattle were not loaded fat, steady, and calm, Thorn Mesa lost the contract that paid winter wages. Hungry hands made careless hands. Careless hands made wild cattle. Wild cattle made buyers ride away with their money still in their pockets. Clay did not need his account book to know what came after that. No beef money. No wages. No crew. His father's ranch, gone one man at a time. The wagon stopped in front of the cookhouse, and the yard seemed to hold its breath. "If that is Toller with the cook, tell him he is late," Jeb Hawkins called from the corral rail. Clay wiped dust from his mouth with the back of his wrist and walked toward it. He let himself hope for exactly 3 steps. A man could be a fool for 3 steps and still recover. Josiah Crimp climbed down first, thin as a fence slat, with his agency hat sitting too high on his head. Behind him came Mrs. Bell, the matron who handled most of the women's placements between Casper and the Platte Road. Last came a woman in a dark blue travel dress, holding a carpet bag in one hand and a flat hat in the other. No apron, no flour on her sleeves, no roll of knives tied in sacking. A bride's veil, folded small and crushed from travel, lay over the top of her bag. The wind lifted one corner of it, and the thin lace brushed her gloved knuckles like a touch she did not want witnessed. The men went quiet in the way men did when they had found a new cruelty and wanted someone else to speak it first. Clay stopped 3 paces from the wagon. "I ordered a cook," he said. The woman did not answer at once. Evelyn Price looked first at the yard because a person learned more from faces than from questions. She saw hungry men with dust in their beards, one foreman already annoyed by her dress, a cookhouse door hanging open like a mouth waiting to mock her, and a rancher whose anger had gone still instead of loud. The veil scratched the back of her hand. She folded her fingers around the carpetbag handle until the lace stopped moving. She was not a girl. She was a clear-eyed woman of 27 or so, travel-worn and stiff from long hours on a board seat. Her gloves were mended at 2 fingers. Her mouth pressed flat once, then steadied. "My name is Evelyn Price," she said. "The Cheyenne Matrimonial and Domestic Agency told me Thorn Mesa requested a wife with kitchen experience." One of the younger hands laughed before he could stop himself. Clay turned his head. The laugh died. Josiah Crimp spread his hands as if the mistake were a legal wrinkle, and not a woman standing in front of 38 witnesses. "Domestic classification is broad under agency terms, Mr. Marrick. Your letter requested a cookhouse placement. Her file listed marriageable character, domestic skill, and willingness to relocate. The agency made a practical consolidation. I did not order a wife." Evelyn's eyes moved once toward the open road behind the wagon. There was no town in walking distance, only rutted track, sage, and noon heat already rising off the yard. She heard the words as the men heard them. A woman delivered where she had not been wanted. A woman whose return depended on the same man saying no in front of everyone. Mrs. Bell looked down at the toe of her shoe. Clay saw that look. It was small, but it was not innocent. He took one breath before anger could make him careless. "Miss Price," he said, "step out of the wagon shade. I will not discuss your future over a wheel hub." Josiah's smile sharpened. "Her future is simple. If you refuse delivery after transport and presentation, the breach fee falls due. If she cannot cover return fare, lodging, and administrative expense, The agency retains placement authority until her account is balanced. She is not freight. She is contracted. Evelyn's fingers tightened on the carpetbag handle, but her voice stayed level. I have not signed a marriage paper with this man. No, Josiah said. You signed with the agency. Clay looked at the folded veil, at Mrs. Bell's lowered face, then at the cookhouse door hanging open behind him. He had men to feed. He had a contract breathing down his neck, but there were different kinds of hunger, and one of them made men think a woman's fear could be counted like flour. Jeb, Clay said, open the little bunkhouse by the north fence. Jeb blinked, boss. Open it. The foreman moved, though doubt crossed his face plain enough for Evelyn to see. Clay turned back to her. I have no wife to offer you because I asked for none. I do have work for pay if you can cook for a cattle crew. $2 a day until the beef ships. Separate bunkhouse. Inside latch. Your carpetbag stays with you. If you want the return road, I will put fare in your hand after supper and send a man to carry you as far as the rail siding in daylight. No one here has a claim on you. The men listened harder now. Josiah's smile disappeared. That does not satisfy the agency. I was not speaking to the agency. Evelyn looked at Clay as if she were measuring whether a decent sentence could hold weight in a yard full of men. And if I say I can cook, then you cook. If the crew eats, you are paid. If the crew will not eat it, you still leave with daylight and fare enough to reach Cheyenne. That last part cost him. Clay could feel the numbers tighten. Fare, lost time, hungry men, buyer coming, but he kept his face still. Evelyn looked toward the cookhouse. What stores do you have? Jeb snorted from the bunkhouse door. Not enough for miracles. She turned and looked at him. I asked what stores you had, not what kind of faith. Two of the men coughed into their hands. Clay felt the first dangerous pull of a smile and did not let it show. Beans, flour, coffee, salt pork, a crate of onions, some dried apples if the rats did not vote first, and beef nobody has time to cut proper. And 38 men. 38. Then I need water boiling. 2 men peeling onions. 1 man cleaning every pan your last cook left filthy, and someone to show me where he hid the sugar. Jeb folded his arms. Lady, this is a cattle ranch, not a hotel. Evelyn walked past him toward the cookhouse, then stopped standing in front of the door like a doorman. This time Clay did smile. It was gone before she saw it, but not before Mrs. Bell did. The cookhouse had been abused by a lazy man and abandoned by an angry one. Evelyn stood in the doorway only a second, long enough to see the blackened pans, the flour tracked on the planks, the cold stove, the sour rag over the pump shelf, and the coffee pot crusted so thick it looked tarred. No one had wanted her here. That was plain. But need was need, and need had never insulted her as sharply as pity. You, she said, pointing at a red-haired hand near the door. Water. He looked behind him, as if she might mean some other man. If your name is Water, yes. If not, bring it anyway. Clay leaned one shoulder against the doorframe. His name is Rafe. Today it is Water. Rafe went. You, she told another, older man with a scar through his beard. Onions. Peel them outside unless you want tears in the beans. I don't take orders from brides, the man said. Evelyn put her carpetbag on the cleanest chair and rolled up her sleeves. Good. I am not your bride. The room shifted. It was not laughter this time. It was attention. Clay pushed off the doorframe. You heard her. The older man looked at Clay. Clay looked back. After a long second, the man took the onion crate and carried it outside. Evelyn found the sugar in a covered crock behind a sack of salt, found cornmeal under the counter, found a rind of smoked ham wrapped in newspaper, and found that the last cook had left enough grease to season a week's worth of contempt. She gave orders without raising her voice. Men who had ridden night guard and hated kitchen work obeyed because the rancher stood there with his arms folded, and because hunger made a man humble. Within 20 minutes, the stove breathed heat. Within 40, coffee steamed. Within an hour, beans thickened with onion and ham, flatbread browned in iron pans, and strips of beef hissed under salt. Jeb came in once, sniffed the air, and looked annoyed that it had improved. "You put apples in beans?" he asked. "Not enough for sweetness, enough to keep men from knowing how little pork you have." "That a cook trick?" "That is a poor woman's trick." Jeb had no answer for that. Clay carried in a bucket himself, though a ranch owner had no need to do it. Evelyn noticed. She also noticed he set it down and left instead of hovering over her shoulder. That mattered more than compliments. At the long table, the first bowls went down. Men took them with the suspicious silence of those prepared to mock. Then spoons scraped, bread tore, coffee poured. The red-haired Rafe burned his tongue and reached for a second piece of flatbread anyway. "Well," Jeb demanded from the end of the table. The scarred older man shrugged. "Tastes like supper." From men who had expected none, that was a sermon. Clay ate standing by the door, watching the yard through the open gap, because the buyer's deadline still pressed against every minute. Evelyn carried the last bowl to the table and found one place left empty near the end. "Sit," Clay said. She shook her head. "Cooks eat after." At Thorn Mesa, the person who made the food eats before the men forget manners. Some of the men looked down at their bowls. Evelyn sat. The bench was rough beneath her skirt. The room smelled of smoke, onion, coffee, and men too tired to pretend they were not grateful. She took one bite because her hands had begun to tremble, and she did not want anyone seeing. Clay saw anyway. He did not soften his voice in front of the men. That would have made her small. He only set a cup of coffee near her elbow and said, "Miss Price gets $2 today." "If the crew eats," Jeb said, but there was less bite in it. Clay looked over the table. Every bowl was emptying. "The crew is eating." Evelyn kept her eyes on her own spoon, but the line of her shoulders changed. Josiah Crimp returned just as the second pot of coffee was poured. He had waited outside because men were easier to cheat when they were hungry, and he did not like seeing them fed before his price was named. Mrs. Bell followed him, pale under her bonnet. "Very touching," Josiah said from the doorway. "A temporary arrangement does not settle agency damages." Clay set his coffee down. "You will not do business from my cookhouse door." "Then I will do it in your yard. $10 breach fee for refused bride delivery, $5 wagon expense, and $3 lodging lien on Miss Price until settlement, or she returns under agency authority." Evelyn stood. Her spoon made no sound when she placed it beside the bowl. "Mrs. Bell, did you stamp me as a bride or a cook?" Mrs. Bell's eyes flickered. Josiah answered for her. "The stamp is agency property." "I asked Mrs. Bell." The matron's mouth parted. No words came. Clay saw the truth in that silence. Evelyn saw it too, and her face changed in a way that made Clay's anger colder. "You knew," Evelyn said. Mrs. Bell looked toward the men, then away. "The agency had already taken your placement fee. Mr. Crimp said Thorn Mesa needed domestic help and that the rancher was unmarried. It was not so different." No one in the room moved. Evelyn's voice stayed quiet. "A stove is not a wedding vow." Clay turned to Josiah. "You have your answer." Josiah stepped into the cookhouse, bold now because money made him stupid. "The answer is that your ranch used agency labor. If you do not pay the fee, I can put a notice at the siding. No reputable buyer likes a ranch that refuses lawful charges." Jeb stood at the end of the table, careful. Josiah smiled at him. "Are your wages paid yet?" That landed. The men knew too well that their money was still tied to tomorrow's beef. Clay could feel their worry shift toward him. Josiah had not brought a gun. He had brought arithmetic, and arithmetic could scare hungry men more than bullets. Evelyn stepped from the bench. "Mr. Marrick gave me work with wages. That is not agency labor. You are agency property until your account is cleared." Clay moved so fast the bench scraped behind him. He did not touch Josiah. He did not need to. "Say property again in my cookhouse," Clay said, "and you will finish that sentence from the yard." Josiah's throat worked. He adjusted his cuffs and backed one step. Evelyn looked at Clay then, not like a rescued woman, but like a woman checking whether the door he had opened was still hers to walk through. Clay made himself look away first. If he turned that look into romance too soon, he would be no better than the men trying to profit from her fear. "Miss Price," he said, "your return fare still stands." "I know. Do you want it now?" Josiah's eyes brightened, because if she left he could still catch her at the siding. Evelyn looked around the cookhouse, at the men who had laughed, at Mrs. Bell who had known, at Clay who was waiting as if her answer mattered more than his contract. "No," she said, "not tonight." Josiah's face tightened. "I said I could cook for a cattle crew," Evelyn continued. "I have only proved I can feed one meal to men too hungry to complain. That is not the same thing." Jeb made a sound that might have been reluctant respect, if it had not been buried under a cough. Clay nodded once, "Then tomorrow you prove the rest." Josiah leaned close enough that only Evelyn, Clay, and Mrs. Bell heard him. "Tomorrow," he said, "a ranch full of men will remember you cost them money." He walked out before Clay could answer. That was the first time Evelyn understood the mistake had not ended with her arrival. It had only been delivered. The next morning began before the sky changed. Evelyn woke in the little bunkhouse by the north fence with the inside latch still set and her carpetbag against the bed. Clay had not sent anyone near the door. No drunk hand had tested the latch. No man had called through the wall. The quiet itself was a kind of proof. On the small table lay 3 coins wrapped in paper, her first day's pay. Under it, in Clay's square handwriting, was one line: "For work done, not for favors owed." Evelyn read it twice, then folded the paper and put it in her bag. By sunrise she was in the cookhouse, cutting salt pork thin enough to lie to a skillet and making coffee strong enough to keep riders from falling asleep in their saddles. Men came in quieter than yesterday. Some nodded. Rafe brought water before she asked and blushed when she called him by his real name. Clay came in last, his coat dusted from the pens. "Buyer comes by noon," he said. "Then breakfast should not sit heavy. You know cattle work. I know men who work before daylight cannot think on bad coffee and grease. That is more than our last cook knew." She glanced toward the window where Jeb and 2 men were moving sacks in the feed shed. "Your foreman does not trust me." Jeb trusts slowly. "Do you?" Clay did not answer right away. The cookhouse noise thinned around them. "I trust what I see," he said at last. "Yesterday I saw 38 men eat. This morning I saw the north bunkhouse latch still set when I passed, which means no man here forgot my order. By noon I expect to see whether the herd ships." It was not flattery. It was better than flattery. "And what did you see when the agency wagon opened?" she asked. Clay's jaw shifted. A woman put where she did not consent to stand. Her hands paused over the dough. He picked up the water bucket before she could tell him not to. "I also saw a woman who knew how to make a room obey without begging it." Then he left. Evelyn went back to kneading, because there was no other respectable thing to do with the warmth that rose through her. By mid-morning, the ranch had become motion. Riders brought the beef down from the lower pasture. Dust lifted beyond the pens. The bell cow, a broad red creature called Dolly, led the steers with slow importance, her bell clanking against her neck. Evelyn watched from the cookhouse door while stirring a pot of cornmeal mash for the crew's noon meal. She had grown up around farms, not trail herds, but hunger and animals had similar rules. Both told the truth if a person paid attention. The first warning came through smell. Rafe rolled a barrel of molasses feed past the cookhouse. It should have smelled dark and sweet. Instead, beneath the sweetness, Evelyn caught a greasy sourness like old tallow left too near heat. "Stop," she called. Rafe paused, need it moved. "Open it." Jeb said take it to the east trough. "Open it first." Jeb came around the shed corner. "What now?" Evelyn wiped her hands on her apron and crossed the yard. Clay stood near the main pen with a buyer in a gray coat. Josiah Crimp was there too, which Evelyn did not like. The agency man stood beside a supply wagon, smiling as if the ranch had invited him. Rafe pried the barrel lid. The smell rose stronger. Evelyn leaned over it, then stepped back. "Do not feed this." Jeb laughed once. "Lady, cattle are not parlor guests." "This is cut wrong." Molasses feed always smells strong. "Not like rancid fat." Jeb dipped 2 fingers in and rubbed them together. "Feels fine." "Then feed it to your horse first." The men near enough heard that. Jeb's face reddened. Josiah's voice floated over from the pen. "Is there a problem with the cook now?" Evelyn looked at him. He looked too pleased. Clay crossed the yard. "What is it?" "This feed is wrong," Evelyn said. "Tallow or spoiled grease, maybe worse. If they take it, it could turn their stomachs or make them fight the trough." The Cheyenne buyer frowned. "I came to buy beef, not kitchen opinions." Jeb looked at Clay. "Boss, if we hold feed now, they will be restless at loading." Clay looked into the barrel, then at the herd. Men were waiting. The buyer was watching. Josiah was listening. The contract stood on legs, horns, and minutes. "How sure are you?" Clay asked. Evelyn felt the yard tighten around that question. She wanted to say completely. She wanted to sound so certain no man could doubt her, but trust built on pretense would break at the first shove. "Sure enough that I would not serve it to animals I needed calm," she said. "Not sure enough to name what was done without time." Jeb spread his hands. "There, she smells a barrel and guesses." "Dolly refused the first scoop," Rafe said. Jeb turned on him. "You were told to pour it." Rafe swallowed. She pulled back. Clay looked toward the bell cow. Dolly stood away from the east trough, ears twitching, while 3 steers nosed and backed. Josiah stepped closer. "Mr. Marrick, the Thorn Mesa account bought that feed through my supply connection because your cookhouse emergency delayed the usual order. If your temporary cook spoils delivery by making men skittish over smell, I cannot help what the buyer concludes." There it was, not proof, pressure. Evelyn met Clay's eyes. In them she saw the ranch, the wages, the years of work, the dead father he had not named, and the question no decent man wanted to ask a woman on her second day. "Are you worth this risk?" Clay turned to Jeb. "Set that barrel aside." Jeb stared. "Boss." "Set it aside." The buyer muttered something under his breath. Josiah smiled without showing teeth. Evelyn knew she had just become expensive. All noon the ranch carried that cost. The cattle were moved to clean grain, but not without trouble. The buyer counted slow and watched every restless steer as if each twitch came out of Clay's pocket. Jeb obeyed orders, yet his doubt followed Evelyn like dust. At dinner, the men ate well and said little. They had heard Josiah. They knew if the buyer cut the price, wages would thin. Evelyn stood at the worktable scraping dough from her knuckles when Clay entered with a folded paper. "The buyer will stay until morning," he said. "He wants to see the herd load clean before he signs full price." "Because of me. Because of the feed. Your men will say because of me." "Some will." She waited. Clay laid the folded paper on the table. Return fare, still yours. If you want the siding, I will send Rafe with the buckboard now, before Josiah can set another hook. The cookhouse had emptied except for them. Outside, cattle shifted in the pens with low, uneasy sound. The air smelled of cooling bread and dust. Evelyn touched the paper but did not pick it up. If I go, your men will believe I ruined the feed and ran. I know. If I stay, they may lose wages. I know that too. Do you want me to go? Clay took his hat off. The gesture made him look younger for half a second and more tired. Want has been the trouble since you stepped off that wagon. She looked up. He did not move closer. I want to cook. I want the beef shipped. I want crimp off my land. I want every man here paid. And yes, Miss Price, I want you at that table more than is wise for a man who has no right to ask anything until you are free of this mess. The honesty struck harder than a compliment. Evelyn looked at the return fare. Then she looked toward the corral, where Dolly's bell sounded once in the dark. My father kept 2 milk cows after my mother died, she said. One would eat anything. One would starve before she touched spoiled mash. The stubborn one lived longer. Clay listened. If Dolly will not take that feed, I trust her more than I trust Josiah Crimp. That is not an answer about the fare. Evelyn pushed the paper back to him. Hold it until morning. If I am wrong, I will use it. If I am right, I intend to be paid for both days. Something moved in Clay's face, not quite a smile and not quite pain. You should know, he said. If the buyer cuts price, Thorn Mesa may not be a safe future for anybody. Then I am not choosing a future. I am choosing not to let a liar write my ending tonight. Clay folded the fare and put it back in his pocket. At the door he stopped. Lock your bunkhouse. I have. Good. Mr. Marrick. He turned. Tomorrow, if Dolly refuses the East Trough again, lead her with dry grain, not molasses. Let her make the others trust the chute. Will that work? If she is truly the bell cow. And if she is not? Evelyn managed a tired smile. Then I suppose I will have been wrong loudly. Clay looked at her for a moment longer than he should have. I have known men paid twice your wages who could not be wrong honestly. He left before she could answer. In the morning, Josiah Crimp made his move before the sun cleared the far ridge. Evelyn was at the stove when the first shout came. Gate! The word tore across the yard. Boots pounded. A horse screamed. Dolly's bell clanged fast, wrong, panicked. Evelyn ran to the doorway with a skillet still in her hand. The east pen stood open. Steers shoved against one another in the gray light, pressing toward the feed trough where the sour molasses had been dragged back in the night. Someone had tipped it enough for the smell to spread. Not much, just enough to pull the hungry animals and rile them when Dolly balked. Men shouted from every side. Jeb was at the gate with 2 hands trying to swing it closed. Clay ran for the loading chute. The Cheyenne buyer stood near the supply wagon, cursing. Josiah Crimp was at the payroll box by the corral rail with one hand on the satchel Clay used for wages. He had waited for chaos because chaos made theft look like settlement. Evelyn saw it all in pieces, and then as one whole thing. Josiah had wanted the herd restless. If the buyer cut the contract, he would claim breach. If the men feared lost wages, he would blame her. If Clay could not pay, Josiah would take the payroll satchel as agency and supply debt. And if Evelyn was still there, she would be the mistake that caused it. Clay reached the chute as a steer slammed sideways into the rail. The board kicked loose and caught him across the shoulder. He staggered but stayed on his feet. Evelyn dropped the skillet. Dolly, she shouted. No one heard her over the herd. She ran back into the cookhouse and seized the sack of dry, cracked grain she had set aside before dawn. Rafe nearly crashed into her at the door. "Get out of the yard," he yelled. "Where is Dolly's clean trough?" "What? Where?" He pointed toward the west side of the pen, where a narrow service gate opened near the loading chute. Evelyn dragged the sack over one shoulder. It was heavier than she expected. Rafe grabbed the other end without being asked. "Jeb," Evelyn shouted. The foreman was fighting the swinging gate. He looked once and shook his head hard. "No. Open the west service gate. You'll get killed. If Dolly turns, the herd turns." Jeb's face twisted. He looked at the cattle, at Clay braced against the damaged chute, at Josiah with the payroll satchel half lifted, and at Evelyn dragging clean grain toward the only path the bell cow might trust. Then he made his choice. "Rafe with her," Jeb bellowed. "Tom, cover that rail, and if I lose a month's wages on this, Miss Price, I am haunting your stove." Evelyn did not waste breath answering. Rafe opened the service gate just wide enough. Evelyn stepped into the churned mud inside the fence, heart hammering so hard she could hear it under Dolly's bell. Clay saw her then. "Evelyn, no." She had never heard him use her first name. There was no time to feel it. Dolly stood 15 yards away, head high, body tense, caught between the stink of the east trough and the pressure of steers behind her. Evelyn cut the grain sack with the small knife she kept in her apron and poured a bright trail on the ground. "Dolly," she called low now. "Come on, girl, you were right, show them." A steer lunged sideways. Rafe slammed a rail between them. Clay shoved himself away from the chute, one arm hanging wrong, and moved toward her despite the pain. "Stay back," Evelyn shouted at him. The order cracked through the yard. Clay stopped. Later, men would remember that, not because she sounded loud, but because Clay obeyed. Dolly's ears flicked, her nostrils widened, she smelled the clean grain. Evelyn stepped backward slowly, pouring more from the sack. "That's it, not that slop, this way." Josiah shouted from the rail, "She is spooking them worse. Marrick, I warned you what that woman would cost." Jeb swung around, "Shut your mouth." Dolly took one step. Then another. The bell steadied. The nearest steers turned their heads toward the sound. Evelyn kept backing toward the west service gate, grain spilling in a narrow line. Her boots slid in churned mud. Rafe held the rail and swore under his breath. Clay stood between her and the worst of the shove, pale with pain, but he did not take the lead from her. Dolly followed. The herd shifted. It was not graceful. It was not quick. One steer broke toward the east trough and Jeb cracked a rope against the rail to turn him. Another slammed the loose chute board and Tom nearly went down. But Dolly came, and where Dolly came, enough of the herd followed to stop the crush. The buyer stopped cursing. Men who had doubted Evelyn began taking her calls. "Dry grain by the west chute," she shouted. "Dry grain," Jeb repeated louder. "Move, you fools." The crew moved. Josiah tried to lift the payroll satchel over the rail. Mrs. Bell, who had been frozen near the agency wagon since the shouting began, suddenly stepped into his path. "No," she said. It was not a brave word. It shook, but it was there. Josiah shoved past her. Clay saw him and started forward, but his shoulder failed. Evelyn saw him too. The herd was turning now, Dolly almost through the west path. If she left the grain line too early, it could break again. "Jeb," she called. The foreman looked. Evelyn pointed at Josiah. Jeb understood and ran. Josiah had one hand on the satchel and one on the rail when Jeb caught him by the back of his coat and slammed him hard enough against the post to knock his hat off. "That payroll is not agency property," Jeb said. "It is settlement against breach." "Then settle it with the cattle," Jeb snapped, "because they seem to hate your feed." By then Dolly had passed the west gate. The steers followed her in a rough, snorting line toward clean grain and the loading lane. Men worked like men who had just been handed one last chance. The buyer watched the herd steady under Dolly's bell and Evelyn's calls. Clay came to Evelyn's side as she emptied the last of the grain. "Your shoulder," she said. "Still attached. Do not be proud while bleeding." "Not bleeding." "Then do not be proud while lying." He laughed once, breathless and pained, and the sound nearly undid her. The buyer walked to the sour barrel. He bent, sniffed, recoiled, and looked toward Josiah. "You supplied this." Josiah straightened under Jeb's grip. The cook tampered with it. Evelyn wiped mud from her hands onto her apron and walked toward the barrel. The yard quieted enough for Dolly's bell to sound through it. "If I tampered with it," she said, "why did I set aside clean grain before daylight?" Josiah opened his mouth. Mrs. Bell spoke first. "Because she warned us yesterday." Every face turned to her. The matron's hands shook around her reticule. "Mr. Crimp told me to stamp her papers as domestic cook after she paid for a marriage placement. He said Thorn Mesa could be pressured either way. Last night I saw him by the feed shed with the tallow pail from his wagon. I did not speak because my desk depends on his accounts." Josiah's face went gray with anger. "You old fool." Evelyn looked at her. The betrayal did not vanish because truth had arrived late. "You let me stand in this yard as a mistake," Evelyn said. Mrs. Bell bowed her head. "Yes." "You let him call me property." "Yes." "Then do not make your regret my payment." Mrs. Bell flinched as if slapped, but Evelyn did not soften it. Some wounds deserved clean air more than comfort. The buyer turned to Clay. "I will take the beef at full price if the loading finishes by noon. That woman kept your herd from blowing through the east fence." Clay looked at Evelyn, not the buyer. "I know." Josiah yanked against Jeb's hold. "You still owe the agency." The old scarred hand from the cookhouse stepped forward. "I heard him offer wages." Rafe stepped beside him. "I heard him say no claim." Another hand lifted his chin. "I ate her food. That was ranch work." Jeb pulled the payroll satchel from Josiah's hand and threw it to Clay's good side. "And I heard myself risk a month's pay on her being right. I would like to keep that pay if nobody minds." A rough laugh moved through the yard, but it was not cruel this time. Clay held the satchel under his injured arm and faced Josiah. "Your supply order at Thorn Mesa is ended." Josiah's eyes flashed. "You cannot run a ranch without supply credit." "I can run it better without spoiled feed." "The agency will blacklist you." Mrs. Bell raised her head. "No, it will not." Josiah turned on her. Her voice was still shaking, but the words came clearer. "I will wire Cheyenne from the siding. I will state that you altered a placement and attempted double collection. I will state that I signed the false stamp. You will lose your desk." "Yes," she said. That was the cost. Not tears, not a bowed head. A desk, a wage, a public correction, and the respect she had tried to keep by spending Evelyn's dignity. Evelyn accepted it with silence. Clay stepped closer to Josiah. "You have until the beef loads to get your wagon off my land. If I see you near my payroll, my cookhouse, or Miss Price's bunkhouse again, I will have Jeb sit on you until the buyer's men can carry you to the siding." Jeb looked Josiah over. "I have sat on worse." This time the men laughed openly. Josiah had no crew now, no payroll, no feed barrel anyone trusted, no matron's silence, no frightened woman alone enough to sign anything. He picked up his hat, slapped dust from it with a hand that trembled, and climbed into his wagon. As he drove out, Dolly's bell sounded from the loading lane, slow and steady. The beef shipped by noon. It took every hand. Clay worked one-armed after Evelyn tied his shoulder tight enough to make him curse. Jeb pretended not to watch her with new respect and failed. Rafe carried water without changing his name again. The buyer signed at full price under the shade of the rail office, then added a small premium for steady loading after feed trouble, which was his careful way of admitting he had nearly been wrong. When the last steer went up the ramp, the men did not cheer. Tired men rarely did. They leaned on rails, wiped their faces, and looked at the train cars as if those boards held winter. Clay opened the payroll satchel. Evelyn stood near the cookhouse door, mud on her skirt, smoke in her hair, and one sleeve torn where the grain sack had caught. She was preparing to go inside because cooks cleaned after everyone else was done, and because part of her still believed a woman should disappear before gratitude became uncomfortable. "Miss Price," Clay called. The yard turned. She stopped. Clay walked to her with Jeb beside him, and the payroll paper folded in his hand. His injured shoulder made his steps stiff. "2 days' wages," he said, "plus hazard pay for saving a beef contract I nearly lost by doubting you." "I did not ask for hazard pay." "No, that is why you are getting it." He held out the coins where everyone could see. Evelyn looked at the money, then at the men, then at Mrs. Bell, who stood by the road with no agency wagon to hide behind, waiting to ride to the siding and make her confession. Evelyn took the coins. Not fast, not shyly. She closed her fingers around them in front of the crew. Clay's voice changed, lower but still clear enough to carry. "You are paid for work done. No agency lien, no breach fee, no man's claim." The words moved through the yard and settled there. That was the receipt, not kindness, not rescue. A woman who had arrived as a mistake now held money earned under her own name, while the men who had laughed watched the difference. Jeb cleared his throat. "Cookhouse is yours through Roundup if you want it." Evelyn looked at him. "Is that an apology?" "No." "Good, I was hoping for something useful." Jeb sighed. "It is a job offer backed by my month's wages and my pride, both of which suffered this morning." "Accepted," Evelyn said. Rafe grinned. The scarred older hand thumped the rail. Someone called, "Does that mean supper?" Evelyn looked over the filthy, exhausted crew and lifted an eyebrow. "It means anyone who wants supper will wash before touching my table." The men groaned as if she had demanded scripture. Clay waited until the noise broke apart before stepping closer. He kept enough distance for the yard to see there was still no claim. "Miss Price," he said, "when the agency matter is finished, when your return fare is still in your hand, and when no man can say you owe Thorn Mesa a day, I would like to ask permission to court you properly." The yard went quiet for a different reason. Evelyn's hand tightened around the coins. "You are asking in front of the men." "I am asking where they can hear the part that matters. You can say no, now or later, and keep your work." Her throat ached. She hated that it did, because she had not cried when Josiah called her property. She had not cried when Mrs. Bell admitted the stamp. But this, the plain shape of a choice made public before tenderness tried to soften it, nearly broke her composure. "My answer now," she said, "is that supper will burn if I stand here being admired." Rafe laughed and tried to hide it. Clay's mouth curved. "That is not a no." "It is not a yes." "Fair." She stepped toward the cookhouse, then paused beside him. Softly enough that only Clay heard, she added, "Ask me after the agency wire is sent." Clay's smile faded into something steadier. "I will." Mrs. Bell left before dusk with Rafe driving her to the siding. Before she climbed into the buckboard, she came to the cookhouse door. Evelyn was cutting biscuits. She did not stop. "I cannot fix what I let happen," Mrs. Bell said. "No." "I will send the wire. I will name myself in it." "Yes." "And your placement fee. I will see it returned from my own wages if the agency will not." Evelyn pressed the biscuit cutter down. "That is a beginning." Mrs. Bell nodded, accepting the smallness of it. "I hope one day it is enough for a civil greeting." Evelyn looked at her then. "Earn the wire first." The older woman swallowed. "I will." After the buckboard rolled out, supper filled the cookhouse with more noise than the first meal had. Men washed because Evelyn stood at the door with a ladle and a look that made argument foolish. Clay sat at the table this time, shoulder bound, face pale from pain he refused to name. Jeb carried plates because Evelyn told him carrying plates was excellent practice for humility. No one called her bride. That absence was its own kind of music. They called her Miss Price, and then after she gave Rafe the burned biscuit for stealing dough, one man risked cook with respect in it. She let that pass. Clay ate what she put in front of him and did not praise it too loudly. He only finished the plate, accepted more coffee, and looked at her once across the lamplit room with a question he had promised to hold. She held it too. The next morning, the wire came back from Cheyenne. Josiah Crimp was removed from agency collections pending inquiry. Mrs. Bell's desk was suspended until her statement was reviewed. Evelyn's placement fee was ordered held for return. No breach fee stood against Thorn Mesa. Jeb read the message aloud because Clay's shoulder made holding paper awkward, and because every man in the yard deserved to hear the claim die in plain words. When he finished, he folded the paper and offered it to Evelyn. She did not take it. "Pin it inside the cookhouse," she said, "not as proof I belong, as warning for any man who thinks a stamp is stronger than a woman saying no." Jeb pinned it by the flower shelf. Then Evelyn took her return fare from Clay. The yard watched again. She weighed the coins in her palm, enough to leave, enough to make every kind word honest because none of them had trapped her. "Rafe," she said, "is the buckboard sound?" Clay went still. Rafe looked from her to Clay and back. "Yes, ma'am." "Good, leave it hitched after breakfast." Clay's face did not change, but she saw the cost move through him. He had promised the road. Now the road stood open. After breakfast, Evelyn carried her carpet bag from the north bunkhouse. She had packed everything. The veil was folded at the bottom, not because she planned to wear it, but because it belonged to the woman she had been when she stepped from the agency wagon, and she would not let Josiah Crimp steal even that foolish hope. Clay waited by the buckboard. "Siding?" he asked. "No." He looked at her then. She put the carpetbag on the buckboard seat, climbed up and took the reins. "I want to see the west pasture before I decide where the new bean pit should be dug. Jeb says the wind shifts wrong by the cookhouse, and for once I believe him." Clay's breath left him slowly. "That is ranch business," he said. "I am your cook through Roundup. Paid cook. Paid cook. With return fare." She patted the pocket where the coins rested. "With return fare." Clay stepped back from the wheel. "Then I suppose the west pasture needs inspection." She looked down at him. The morning light showed the dust in his hair and the bruising near his collar where the rail had struck. It also showed a restraint she trusted because it had cost him. "Mr. Marrick," she said, "the agency wire has been sent." "Yes." "The fee is broken." "Yes." "The road is open." "It is." She held the reins in one hand. "You may ask now." For the first time since she had known him, Clay Marrick looked uncertain in front of his own ranch. Jeb, who was pretending not to listen from 10 feet away, muttered, "Good Lord, boss, do not stare at her like a calf at thunder." Clay shot him a look. Evelyn laughed. The sound surprised them both. It had been waiting somewhere behind fear, work, anger, smoke, and dust. Clay took off his hat. "Evelyn Price," he said, "would you allow me to court you, slow enough that you can change your mind, honest enough that every man here knows the asking came after your wages and your road?" She looked toward the cookhouse, where the wire was pinned by the flour, toward Dolly grazing beyond the fence, Belle quiet now, toward the men washing for breakfast because she had made a rule and they had accepted it, toward the open track that could still take her away. Then she looked back at Clay. "Yes," she said, slowly. Jeb clapped once and tried to make it sound like he had slapped dust from his gloves. Clay smiled without moving closer. "I can do slowly." "You had better. I have biscuits to teach this ranch before I have time for romance. I will put myself on the schedule." "Do not, I dislike crowded schedules." He laughed then, and this time he did not hide it. Evelyn clicked to the horses. The buckboard rolled forward, not toward the siding, but toward the west pasture. Clay walked beside it for the first stretch because his shoulder would not let him ride yet, and because she had not invited him onto the seat. At the bend, she stopped. "Are you coming all the way on foot?" she asked. "Until you tell me not to." She considered him, then moved her carpetbag from the seat to the floorboards. "You may sit," she said, "if your boots are clean." Clay looked down at boots that had seen mud, blood, cattle, and 2 days of trouble. Evelyn lifted one eyebrow. He went to the water trough and washed them while the crew watched in open delight. When he climbed onto the buckboard beside her, he left a careful space between them. Evelyn noticed that too. She picked up the reins and set the horses moving again. Behind them, Thorn Mesa did not look saved in any grand way. It looked like a working ranch after a hard delivery. Rails cracked, dust hanging, men sore, accounts still thin, supper already expected. But the cookhouse door stood open. The wire was pinned where anyone could read it. Dolly's bell rang once from the pasture, steady as a small promise. Evelyn touched the coins in her pocket, then laid that hand back on the reins. She had arrived as a bride no one ordered and a cook no one trusted. She left the yard that morning as a woman paid for her work, free to take the road, and willing to return to the table she had chosen. Clay sat beside her, waiting as he had promised, while she drove toward the pasture that would feed his men through roundup. And when the wind shifted over Thorn Mesa, it carried flour, cattle dust, coffee smoke, and the sound of a woman giving directions to a ranch that had finally learned to listen.